Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, India's economy is on the rise, and the World Bank says the nation is leading growth in South Asia. But are Narendra Modi's economic policies benefiting all Indians? Cleaning up industrial facilities, the US is spending billions of dollars to slash greenhouse gas emissions at steel mills, cement plants and cheese factories. And Microsoft unbundles MS Teams and MS Office after European antitrust scrutiny. Millions of users will now have to buy the chat and video app separately. India is one of the world's fastest growing major economies, courting global investors. Much of the progress has happened in the past 10 years under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's banking on that achievement to win over voters and seal a third term in office in general elections starting later this month. Many Indians say they are better off, but observers say the wealth gap has widened. Let's have a look at some of the numbers. India is now the fifth largest economy in the world, up from ninth position half a century ago. By 2030, it's expected to overtake Germany and Japan to become the third largest economy behind the United States and China. A major driver of that growth is infrastructure. More than $130 billion has been allocated to build assets like roads and ports this year. India is also trying to boost its manufacturing sector, which accounts for nearly 17% of GDP. It aims to replace China as a global production hub. But the economic gains are spread unequally. Oxfam says the top 10% of India's population of 1.4 billion owns nearly 75% of the total national wealth. More than 40% of India's workforce are employed on farms in poorly paid jobs. The rest are almost evenly distributed amongst the industrial and service sectors. Well, the World Bank says the nation is leading growth in South Asia. The region is expected to remain the fastest growing emerging market for the next 2 years. But the bank warns South Asian countries are failing to create enough jobs for their young population. Many nations are struggling with poverty and a rising cost of living. Manel Fernandez reports from Colombo.
Better than expected performance from India has boosted South Asia's growth forecast to 6% this year. The figure was released during the World Bank South Asia Development Update launched in Colombo last week.
But once you take out India, it's more like 3.75% in 2024 and 4.25% in 2025.
Expansion supported by rapid increases in investment and government consumption has driven the Indian economy to grow by more than 8% in the fourth quarter of 2023. But the World Bank says its neighbours are struggling.
Sri Lanka, which hit bankruptcy in 2022, is slowly stabilising after it secured a $3 billion IMF bailout package. But crippling austerity measures seen by many to unfairly target the poorest segment of the population are causing frustration. Soaring costs in Pakistan are driving hundreds of people to rely on charity during the Ramadan season. Mohammed is one of them. The father of 5 is a daily wage worker.
It's very hard to find work these days. The government says it's subsidizing some food items during Ramadan. But who can afford other commodities and pay the high electricity and gas bills?
Like Mohammed, millions of South Asians are struggling because not enough jobs are being created.
In South Asia, it's the employment ratio that matters, the share of the working age population that is employed. That's what matters. Everywhere else in other emerging markets and developing economies has stayed constant. In South Asia, it's fallen.
The reliance on government spending due to falling private investment is another shared worry. And the World Bank maps out measures to spark an acceleration in private investment growth. Bangladesh introduced trade and foreign currency restrictions to ward off a balance of payments crisis. The country has also seen high inflation. Governments across South Asia say they are trying to improve fiscal discipline and build resilient economies. The World Bank says more work is needed, but many people in the world's most populous region aren't convinced this will improve their lives. Manel Fernandez, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Colombo.
Well, joining us now from Tokyo is Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis Bank. Very good to have you here on Counting the Cost. India's economy, it's booming and it's on an incredible trajectory. What's driving this?
Well, lots of things. Lots of things are driving India. The first of all is self-confidence. You know, India has basically had already a very strong leader, Modi, with very clear ideas as to the way to go. India first, but also India for all. It means that manufacturing FDI is welcome in India, which is a big change from the past. We have many companies, Foxconn, Apple, knocking at the door of India's manufacturing market, both for the domestic market, but increasingly for exports. And that's a big change for India, is the new manufacturing drive that has basically changed the nature of what India really is about as an economy.
Well, let's pick up on that manufacturing drive. I mean, India wants to overtake China as the global manufacturing hub. Is that foreseeable? Is that possible?
Put it this way, India does not need to overtake China for a very simple reason, because the era of manufacturing as the most important driver for growth is over in as far as now digital services are the key. So yes, India needs some manufacturing to avoid big deficits because it needs lots of things to get its population moving into urban areas as China did, but not as much to feed the world as China did, because the world now needs something else. The world needs services, high-end services, and India is a better place to do that than China. So in a way, India has the right skills, I would say, for a new era, an era of digital services.
Now that's benefiting a certain amount of the population, isn't it? We've got to remember that the vast majority of India is in the informal sector, it's in farm work, it's low, poorly paid jobs. When it's this slogan, India for all, is this booming economy benefiting all?
Smart question. That's the $1 million question for India. India really needs to be very careful about avoiding what China, to me, did relatively well, but still, 400 million people out of poverty, but still really not managing to cope with the income disparity. For India, this could be even worse, because I think India will have a much harder time in bringing to the cities the population in that organized way, which China did thanks to the hukou, the so-called registration or compulsory registration to live in big cities. And I think for India, it will be much harder. There's also the north and south divide that is very, very strong for India. So my sense is that India could have a harder time, basically, in avoiding income disparities from what China has already had, which is one of its biggest problems. So you're right. This is really a key issue for India.
Because if we look at The Economist in Manel's report, and we look at the World Bank report, it's saying that South Asia is growing, but employment levels are actually falling. Why is that? Because
they have so far failed in creating a big manufacturing landscape like Southeast Asia so far. We have pockets of it, as I mentioned, in India, but it's really brand new. We have Bangladesh with the textile industry, but it's really minor compared to the growing population. Just remember that South Asia's population grows much faster than Southeast Asia's population. So this is why they need many more jobs. And this is really very hard to create nowadays because you need the investment to do so. You need the companies to believe in your company. It's just not in your country. It's just not so easy. So yes, creating the right employment is the way to go, but they need to certainly fight to attract that foreign investment to create those factories. And as I said, also services, not only goods.
Yeah. You mentioned Bangladesh there. I mean, it's aiming to become a developed country by 2041. India, if we could bring in India again, wanting to become a developed country by 2047. Are these realistic goals?
Well, I've made my calculations comparing China to India, and I have to say, if India, which to me is rather easy, keeps a growth rate of around 7%, which is what India has had in the last 10 years, for 20 years or so, which is basically the key urbanization process for India. India is 35% of the population is urbanized. It's very low. China is 60. So if you keep that growth rate, I think, India could be a moderately developed economy by 2040, around $25,000. So which is what China will be in 2035. So there will be a little bit of a convergence. By 2050, I think India will be larger, double the population and larger in economic size than China. But many things can happen before that. It's just a linear projection.
Absolutely. Okay, Alicia Garcia Herrero, very interesting to speak to you. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost. Now, mac and cheese, it's the ultimate comfort food. The pre-packaged meal is hugely popular across America, but it does take a lot of energy to produce. Food processing and heavy industries such as cement and concrete production account for nearly a quarter of US greenhouse gas emissions. The Biden administration has announced up to $6 billion in grants to help clean up dozens of facilities, the single largest industrial decarbonisation investment in American history. The Department of Energy says the money will fund more than 30 projects in sectors including aluminium, chemicals, iron and steel. Nearly 80% of the projects will operate in deprived areas. The initiative will prevent an estimated 14 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions annually. That's equivalent to getting 3 million cars off the roads for a year. Well, joining us now from Austin in Texas is Robert Schuer. He's Executive Director of Carbon Tracker's North America office. So, Robert, $6 billion to decarbonise 33 projects across 8 different areas. Let's zoom in on the mac and cheese example, because I think that's the one everyone's a little bit interested in there. What are the plans to reduce emissions with that project?
Well, I don't have the details exactly on all the projects here, but all of these projects share a common theme. And the common theme is taking something that is sub-commercial and commercializing it in a particular context that will then allow the emissions reductions that can be captured by that project to scale.
But how do we go about that?
Well, so in each of these instances, what the government is looking for is we're really working out the kinks with a new technology, and by doing so, find out the most efficient way to do that process, whether it's reducing emissions from the production of mac and cheese or circular economy concepts with respect to refining and other projects. And by doing so, make it cheaper so that others can emulate those kind of projects as these various industries, heavy industries, or hard to abate sectors decarbonize.
Yeah, so why is it that industrial emissions from the heavy industries or from these type of industries are so hard to reduce?
You can imagine that we have a number of sectors where what we really need to do is reduce consumption. So those are the end use of fossil fuels. Those have alternatives that have become economic. So we see electric vehicles, for example, as opposed to internal combustion engines as an example of that. We can also substitute in power the use of power from a gas generating plant by power from wind and solar, often combined with batteries as we increase the amount of renewables on board. But in some of these hard to abate industries, it's more difficult because we have issues like high amounts of heat that have to be generated as part of the industrial process or other things where fossil fuels have an edge and where there aren't commercial substitutes. And so the goal of this money is really to deliver more commercializable substitutes for those processes.
So the idea is to take what has been learned and achieved in these 33 projects and replicate it across the country. Are there global aspirations for it as well?
I absolutely think so, because, mind you, part of this is to reduce the U.S. emissions. And so industrial emissions in the U.S. represent about 23% of U.S. emissions. But in doing so, also offer approaches to doing that can be commercialized scale, not just in the U.S., but also abroad. And I should also add that making those emissions reductions now may also make U.S. industry much more competitive going forward, particularly if we see things like border adjustments on carbon, as we're seeing out of the EU.
So because the US is one of the world's top carbon emitters, it's got a target to be net zero by 2050. Do you think it's going to hit that target?
Well, I think if you look at this from a linear perspective, so these projects, these 33 projects are expected to reduce, I think, 1% of U.S. emissions, right? So if you look at this linearly and say, well, we're not going to get there by 2050 if we're doing 1% a year, but it's both part of a larger picture and also really trying to use the S-curves that we see in new technology deployment to scale. So I wouldn't expect it to be linear year over year, but to have some kind of scaling as the costs come down. And that's what we've seen with wind and solar, for example.
These projects are largely based in deprived areas. How are they also set to improve the lives of the people who live in those areas?
Yeah, well, so a number of these projects have, on a couple of levels. So from a labor standpoint, I believe these projects collectively are expected to produce about 80,000 jobs. Many of them, as you note, in areas that are, we would say, are blue-collar areas, so heavy labor base. The jobs are going to be based there. That's valuable. And many of the parties to these contracts also agree to employ labor, so unionized workers, as part of the work. But I would also say that there are going to be co-benefits because they're not just reducing emissions, often point source emissions, so emissions that are in those locations, but I believe about 85% of the projects are going to be reducing criteria air pollutants. So those are other emissions like, small PM2.5 and other particulates that would otherwise have been emitted.
Robert Stewart, great to speak to you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to join. Thank you.
The Baltimore bridge collapse and disruption to operations at one of America's biggest ports is expected to have a major impact on the local economy. And questions are being raised on whether corners are being cut as cities compete against each other to attract container ship business, and whether they're avoiding paying for necessary infrastructure upgrades to ensure safety. Shia Bratanzi reports.
Several temporary channels are being opened on the Patapsco River, bypassing the wreckage of the Francis Scott Key Bridge for smaller marine traffic. But there's no time frame for reopening the Port of Baltimore to major cargo traffic. The port ranked 9th for total U.S. container imports in 2023. Nonetheless, the U.S.'s supply chains and global trade are not expected to be affected as cargo is rerouted to other ports on the East Coast. That's not much comfort for businesses in the Baltimore region itself. Lewis Kelly's construction business will now have to make arrangements to transport supplies by road or rail from wherever his goods end up.
With things being rerouted, we don't know what the freight costs would be coming from Pennsylvania or from Virginia. We also don't know what the timelines are.
Once the port does reopen, importers supplying companies in the region will return. But will freight companies who use Baltimore to import goods for the U.S. as a whole, having spent months establishing alternate arrangements at other rival ports? This is one of the ports on the eastern seaboard that are able to receive massive ships with a capacity of up to 10,000 containers. However, it is thought other ports in New York, New Jersey, and Virginia will be able to handle the diverted container traffic. Cargo ship size has doubled since 1986. The Dali is bigger than the Eiffel Tower, maximizing profitability for the freight companies. But if Baltimore now loses its mega container ship business as a result of this collision, it would be grimly ironic. Since the crash, it's emerged that there had long been warnings that in its bid to compete with other cities for these gigantic vessels to unload at Baltimore, corners were being cut. Taxpayer funds were being used to attract freight companies through the building of bigger facilities for their ships to enhance their profitability. But Baltimore wasn't ensuring that the bridge these mega ships would be traveling under was ready.
In Baltimore, they dredged the channels, they widened the berths, they widened turning radiuses, they fortified wharf and dock structures, but they actually didn't do anything to fortify the bridge, even though a cargo ship had collided with it in 1980.
And Baltimore isn't alone. Recent studies suggest that 8 other bridges in the US are as vulnerable as the key bridge to a collision with a massive container ship. Shia Bertansi, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Baltimore, Maryland.
Now, it became one of the hits of remote working during the pandemic. More than 300 million people use Microsoft Teams, making it the world's most popular business communication service. But rivals of the chat and video app accuse it of illegally crushing competition. And EU regulators say bundling the platform with Microsoft's Office products may be anti-competitive. The US tech giant is now making changes to how the app is sold. Microsoft will allow business customers globally to buy Teams separately from its Office product. The app was added for free to Office 365 in 2017. Teams says new customers now have to pay more than $5 for the standalone app. The announcement by the tech giant comes 6 months after it unbundled the two products in Europe in an attempt to avoid an EU antitrust fine. Let's take a closer look now at the background to this case. The European Commission received a complaint of possible anti-competitive practices by Microsoft in 2020. It was by the owners of a competing workspace messaging app known as Slack. The European Commission opened a formal antitrust investigation in July 2023 into Microsoft's bundling of Teams with other Office products, citing anti-competitive concerns. The European Commission is also investigating Microsoft over other antitrust concerns. They include the level of its fees and the ability of competitor messaging services to interface with Office applications. Microsoft risks a fine of as much as 10% of its global annual revenues if found guilty of antitrust breaches. It's racked up more than $2.4 billion in EU antitrust fines in the past decade. Well, joining us now from Brussels is Christina Cafara. She's a well-known economist who's worked as an expert on the most high-profile antitrust cases over the past 20 years, advising both companies and governments. So, Christina, you're well placed to be talking about this here on Counting the Cost. Thanks very much for joining us. How much of a victory is this for Microsoft's competitors, that space has now been made for alternatives like Slack and Zoom?
What Microsoft has done proactively, it has to be said, in the sense that they were not explicitly forced to do this yet by the Commission. We're far from the stage where the European Commission can mandate certain outcomes. It is proactively seeking to deflect concern. What Microsoft has done is to say, okay, I'm unbundling this. I'm essentially allowing people to create their own bundle. You want the Office suite, you buy it at a small discount. This is for new customers. You want to match it with Teams, as it was before. You can buy Teams standalone for $5 price. If you don't want Teams, you can still buy the Office suite and match it with Zoom or Slack. And there is enough of a discount there to allow you to do that. Now, the big question for competitors will obviously be, well, is that discount enough to incentivize people to buy that $2 discount relative to the current price? Is it going to be enough room for users to see it as worthwhile to buy their product and match it with the Office suite? Now, remember that the Teams product is being sold standalone at $5 now. So the price for the entire Microsoft bundle, Office and Teams, has gone up somewhat. So the expectation is that that is the sort of the space in which this will be played. And in principle, it does create some space.
It does, but the problem is, isn't it, that as you allude to, the Microsoft platform, it does everything so well. It's so easy to use. It's so cumbersome to bring in different apps and different platforms to it that maybe there just isn't room for single product companies in the market.
This is the fundamental question that many regulators around the world are grappling with when it comes to digital platforms. The essence of digital platforms is that they are ecosystems, and they find it very easy to extend the Office of the products they offer in multiple functionalities. The benefit to the user is that the user gets a seamless product, which works well, which is integrated. And this is the argument the platforms are making. Look, the consumer gets a benefit. They buy a single product. It works seamlessly. They don't have to bother their head with assembling different things together, and it works. The problem then this creates for regulators is that they're faced by very vocal complainants like Slack, like Zoom, saying, but how are we going to ever survive in this world if there is no room for us to essentially insert ourselves into the bundle? The consumer can create its own bundle, and in principle, it can work. So the problem is particularly acute with software, which is really where Microsoft as a platform is. Because if you think about the business model as it was in the past, we all used to buy every 2 years an upgrade to the software. Now it's all a subscription model, which implies constant updates of the features and functionalities. So the entire business model is based around, I am giving people more. They're subscribing to my bundle, and I'm continuing updating, innovating, adding features. Now, that, again, in principle, is a benefit for consumers, but it leaves the question of where do people stand when they're only selling one functionality? So what's the answer to this? I mean, Microsoft essentially is looking at the commission and saying, okay, I'm unbundling. What now? Is that solving a problem? How far do you want us to go? Our entire business model is a bundle. You want us to price a la carte every single individual feature and functionality that are in the bundle? Do we think that that will be good for consumers? Won't it create enormous complexity and enormous cumbersome and friction? So that is really where the question lies.
And it sounds like the EU, the EC is struggling to regulate it as well. Christina Cafaro, sadly, we have run out of time. We will have to leave the interview there. But thank you very much for taking time to join us here on Counting the Cost.
Thank you so much.
And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's also more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Laura Kyle from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.